Hi, my name's Ollie, and in this Politics Explained video, I'm going to go through everything you need to know about the varying nature of presidential power in Edexcel A-level politics. I'm going to start by looking at the parts of the specification this lesson covers, before going on to some potential essay questions, including 12 markers and 30 markers that you could get in the exam. I'm then going to look at the constant limitations on presidential power, including the Constitution and the Supreme Court and the separation of powers. I'm then going to look at the importance of numbers, both in Congress and in Supreme Court numbers and appointments, in determining the president's power. I'm then going to go and have a look at some other factors, including popularity, the individual skills for a president, and the relationship between a president and their party, before looking at the importance of timing, both in terms of the electoral mandate, midterms, and the lame duck presidency, before finishing off by looking at some case studies of presidents since 2000. So I'm going to cover quite a lot in this video. The PDF that you can see on your screen is part of an updated online A-level politics textbook for the US part of the course that you can find on the Politics Explained website, where you can also find lots of other resources to help you in your politics A-level, including essay plans, updated textbooks, detailed notes, and a place to sign up for tutoring if that's something you'd be interested in. But yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. So, starting off with the parts of the specification this lesson covers, and this is 3.3 of the Edexcel US politics and government specification. So looking at the relationship between the presidency and Congress and Supreme Court and why this varies, as well as key limitations on presidential power and why this varies between presidents. So looking at the changing nature of power over their term in office, Congress, the Supreme Court and Constitution, and the election cycle and divided government. And then finally looking at the significance of these limitations with reference to presidents since 1992, which I'm going to do at the end of the video, but also throughout the video. In terms of key essay questions you can get on this, so they'll be really useful for the 12 markers in terms of comparing the influence of the president and the prime minister, as well as a difference in their roles and powers, whether they can be considered more effective than others and what determines their power. And also be really useful for a lot of these essay questions on the presidency, but also questions on a variety of topics, as a lot of the questions in the US part of the course do tend to be cross-cutting. So you can have a look at what determines the presidential power. Is there an imperial presidency? Is popularity the most important factor determining their power? And lots of other potential questions you could get. But starting off, we're going to have a look at constant limitations on the president's power. And the first key one of these is the Constitution and the Supreme Court. And they represent a constant limitation on the power of the president and their ability to achieve their agenda, as the president cannot implement policies or take executive actions that contravene constitutional provisions or establish laws. And this is upheld irrespective of the president's political affiliations or the composition of the Supreme Court. Even if the Supreme Court ideological leanings are aligned with the president's party, it maintains an obligation to interpret and enforce the Constitution impartially. And there's no power of persuasion in relation to the Supreme Court. This means that the president must navigate within the boundaries of the Constitution, and any attempt to extend their influence or achieve their goals that overstep these boundaries can be checked by the Supreme Court through its power of judicial review. In terms of Biden, a key example of this was in June 2023, when the court ruled that Biden's £430 billion student debt forgiveness program was unconstitutional, as Biden had argued that the HEROES Act in 2003, which was passed in response to 9/11, gave him the ability to change student aid program laws, but the Supreme Court ruled that it didn't give him the authority to make such a sweeping change, and it was effectively emergency legislation in relation to the response to 9/11. And this stopped a key aim and campaign promise of the Biden administration that gave him significant support from young voters. So it shows how the Supreme Court and the Constitution are a key limitation on the president's power. This can also be seen in 2017 when the Trump administration sought to end DACA, which is a program initiated by the Obama administration that protected young undocumented immigrants from deportation. And DACA was an executive order. The decision to rescind it was challenged in court, and the case eventually reached the Supreme Court, which ruled that the manner in which the Trump administration sought to end it was arbitrary and capricious, and therefore violated the Administration Procedure Act. And that really shows that the Supreme Court has the power to constrain the president's power by reviewing executive actions, ensuring that they comply with procedural and legal standards, even when the Supreme Court was conservative, as was the president. And finally, with Obama, in the kind of Sibelius case in 2012, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of most of the Affordable Care Act, but it did rule that states couldn't be forced to expand Medicaid, which is a significant component of the Affordable Care Act, and they struck that down. And that shows the limitations of federal power in the Constitution and how the Supreme Court can limit presidential power and uphold federalism. The next key constant limitation on presidential power is the separation of powers, which consistently limits the power of the president irrespective of other varying factors such as the state of the government, whether it's unified or divided, or the personal persuasiveness and political strategies of the president. This principle, deliberately established by the Founding Fathers, aims to prevent the concentration of power in any single branch of government, and it requires that the president work collaboratively with other branches to enact and interpret laws. It kind of really ensures that no branch, especially the executive, becomes too powerful. So the president can't legislate or adjudicate, and their ability to execute laws is contingent on the boundaries set by legislation and judicial interpretation. And key to this is also the separation of personnel, which means that the president can't appoint members of his government from Congress, which really limits their powers of persuasion over legislation, as they don't have the power of patronage that the UK Prime Minister does. In terms of examples, a really good example is from the Trump administration and his efforts to secure funding for his proposed border wall along the US-Mexico border. So after Congress allocated significantly less funding than what Trump requested for the wall, he declared a national emergency at the border in February 2019. This declaration was aimed at redirecting funds from other sources, specifically from military construction projects and counter-drug activities, to finance the wall's construction. The executive action immediately faced legal challenges, with lawsuits arguing that the president was circumventing Congress's constitutional authority over federal spending. Moreover, in a direct response, both the House and Senate, which at the time was controlled by the Republicans, passed a resolution to terminate the emergency declaration. Trump vetoed the resolution, leading to an attempt by Congress to override the veto, which was unsuccessful. This culminated in the longest government shutdown in US history, lasting 35 days because they couldn't agree on the budget in relation to the border wall from December 2018 to January 2019. And this occurred because of the impasse over wall funding, as Congress refused to meet Trump's funding demands. And Trump signed a bill to reopen the government without the full amount of requested funding, and later signed a spending bill passed by Congress that included approximately $1.375 billion for border barrier construction, significantly less than the $5.7 billion he'd originally requested for the wall. This shows how the separation of powers constrains the president even when their party controls Congress. In terms of an example from the Biden administration, in 2021, as part of the COVID-19 relief package, the Biden administration sought to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 per hour. This faced a significant hurdle in the Senate, and the Senate parliamentarian and official responsible for interpreting the Senate's rules ruled that including the minimum wage increase in budget reconciliation process didn't comply with the governing rules of the process. And this effectively required the administration to seek broader legislative support beyond the reconciliation process. So therefore, despite the administration's desire to increase the minimum wage and the fact they had a slim majority in both houses of Congress, it shows the kind of checks and balances within the Constitution and how the separation of power limits the president's ability to do what they want. And finally, separation of powers can be seen in Obama's failure to close the Guantanamo Bay detention camp, which has been kind of a key policy his presidency, but Congress, so he sought to do it through executive orders and consistent advocacy, but Congress used its legislative powers to place restrictions on the transfer of detainees, effectively blocking the closure of the facility. Okay, so they were the constant limitations on presidential power. The next thing we're going to have a look at, kind of I suppose in the remainder of the video, is varying factors which influence how much power the president has. And the first one of these, which I thought I'd kind of highlight in particular, I think is really important, is the importance of numbers, both in Congress and the Supreme Court. So starting in Congress, and the number of a president's party's members in Congress significantly impacts presidential power. So in a unified government, the president is better able to pursue their legislative agenda. The alignment in party agenda and priorities between the executive and legislative branches facilitates smoother passage of legislation, budget approvals, and confirmation of appointments. And this often leads to significant legislative achievements, especially in the early years of a presidency when their political capital is at its peak. Conversely, a divided government often leads to legislative gridlock as partisan divisions hinder the passage of bills. The president faces staunch resistance to their policy proposals, budget plans, and nominations. And the opposition can utilise various tools, including filibusters, committee hearings, and investigations to slow or block the president's agenda. And this kind of leads to greater demand for negotiation and compromise. And presidents often had to resort to executive orders and unilateral actions to achieve their policy goals, though these actions have these actions have a less long-term impact in legislation because they can effectively easily be revoked by the next president. The increasing prevalence of partisanship and polarization in American politics and in Congress has heightened the importance of Congress's composition to a president's power. Under divided government, partisanship makes it even more difficult for a president to pursue their agenda with little compromise between the parties, whereas under unified government, when a president's party has a slim majority in either or both houses, a president is highly dependent on unity among their party members to pass legislation. And increasing political polarization has led to few members of Congress voting with the other party. So just to be clear, I've put kind of either or kind of both houses because they have a slim majority in one and a big majority in the other. So under unified government, they do have a majority in both houses. In terms of examples of the importance of whether there's unified or divided government, Obama's administration clearly demonstrates the impact of congressional party composition. So during his first 2 years in office with a Democratic majority in Congress, Obama achieved significant legislative success, most notably the Affordable Care Act. But after the 2010 midterms, Republicans gained control of the House, leading to a period of legislative gridlock. And this continued for the last 6 years of his presidency. And a notable instance of this gridlock was the unsuccessful nomination of Merrick Garland to the Supreme Court in 2016, when the Republican-controlled Senate broke with precedent and refused to hold hearings on the nomination. They effectively said that they wouldn't make a nomination because it's an election year and they lead it up to the next president, whereas they kind of sought to kind of provide justification for it. In reality, they wanted to wait so that they could get a Republican nomination because they were hoping that Trump would win the election, which he eventually did. And Obama was also unable to pursue other major policy initiatives in Congress, such as comprehensive immigration reform, including the DREAM Act, gun control measures, and climate change legislation. And in relation to a couple of those, the filibuster in particular was used by Republicans to block the agenda. And this forced Obama to rely on more executive actions and orders to pursue his policy goals without congressional support, including DACA, which is effectively the executive order pursued after the DREAM Act was refused, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, and various environmental regulations. In terms of Bush, during his first term, with Republicans controlling both houses, he successfully enacted significant legislation, such as the Tax Cuts and No Child Left Behind Act. But after Democrats won control of Congress after 2006 midterms, he faced increased opposition, leading to legislative challenges in areas like social security reform and immigration policy. And this also constrained his foreign policy, particularly in managing the Iraq War, as the Democratic Congress pushed for greater oversight and began questioning the administration's strategies and slightly defunding funding for troops in Iraq to try and pull the US out of Iraq. In response to these challenges, Bush's use of the veto power became more prominent, as evidenced in vetoes against bills like the Stem Cell Research Enhancement Act and the State Children's Health Insurance Program's expansion. And he also resorted to executive orders on issues such as environmental regulations and counter-terrorism measures, including an executive order authorising the establishment of military tribunals to try suspected terrorists. In terms of Trump, with a Republican majority in both houses during his initial 2 years, he was able to secure a couple of key legislative victories, in particular the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and appoint 2 conservative Supreme Court justices. Even under the divided government, Trump wasn't able to achieve some of the policy aims, such as passing, even under unified government, in his first 2 years, Trump wasn't able to achieve some of his policy aims, such as passing legislation to fund his border wall. And after the Democrats seized control of the House in the 2018 midterms, he faced heightened legislative obstacles. It led to significant confrontations, most notably the standoff, which effectively kind of started in unified government and went through to divided government. And this is the longest government shutdown in US history. And in response to these legislative roadblocks, Trump, as with the other presidents, increasingly utilised executive powers, as seen in his emergency declaration to secure funds for the border wall, and executive orders on immigration and trade policies. In terms of Biden, so Biden's early term was marked by a narrow majority, Democratic majority in both houses. This allowed for early legislative success because the party was able to unite behind a number of policies, even if Republicans didn't vote for them. This can be seen in the American Rescue Plan Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, both of which passed with no Republican votes in either chamber. Biden's slim majority meant that every vote was critical, leading to challenges in advancing other parts of his agenda, though. So the Build Back Better Act was effectively vetoed by Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, who withdrew his support. The Republicans taking control of the House of Representatives in the midterms in 2022 has halted many of Biden's other legislative priorities, such as comprehensive voting rights legislation, gun control legislation, and healthcare legislation, including capping the price of insulin. This being said, Biden has had success in supporting the passage of bipartisan pieces of legislation before and since the midterms, arguably relying less on unilateral executive actions than previous presidents. So the bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed in the Senate with 69 votes for versus 30 against, and the Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2033 is a significant piece of legislation aimed at responsibly increasing the debt ceiling and ending the threat of economic calamity from a default on the nation's debt. And this was passed with support from both political parties, with 314 versus 111 in the House and 63 versus 36 in the Senate. Support from moderates in both parties. So that's how Congress, and whether there's a unified or divided government, the numbers in Congress are really important to how much power the president has. The next key thing in terms of numbers that are really important to the president's power is Supreme Court members and appointments. So we're going to first have a look at how many appointments they can make. So the number of Supreme Court appointments the president can make significantly influences their lasting impact on the political process. And these have profound implications, as those who are appointed are on the court for decades and often have a big impact on US life and US political life. A key role in shaping kind of key legal, social, and political issues. And the opportunity to make appointments based on vacancies is largely based on chance, as vacancies appear when justices retire or die. However, recent years have also seen an intensified politicisation of the appointment process, as shown with what happened with Merrick Garland's appointment in 2016. In terms of the composition of the court, so that's kind of first how many appointments they can make and influence their power, because if they happen to get a lot of vacancies when they're president, they can have a long-term impact on the court, but that's very much based on luck. But in terms of the composition of the court, so the composition of the court during a president's tenure can influence their power. So whilst the court bases its decisions on constitutional interpretation, not on political interpretation at all, the ideological leanings of the justice can sway rulings on key issues. So a court aligned with the president's ideology, so a conservative majority for a Republican president or a liberal majority for a Democrat, is more likely to issue decisions that support and further the president's policy agenda. Conversely, a court with an opposing ideological majority often makes decisions that obstruct or challenge the president's goals, highlighting the pivotal role of the court in shaping policy through its interpretation of the law. In terms of the Obama administration, throughout Obama's tenure, the ideological balance of the court was closely divided, with 4 liberal justices and 5 conservative justices. Though Justice Anthony Kennedy and Chief Justice Roberts sometimes acted as a swing vote and voted with liberal justices in closely divided cases. Obama's appointments of Sonia Sotomayor in 2009 and Elena Kagan in 2010 had little influence on the overall balance of the court, as they replaced outgoing liberal justices. And the court made rulings that both supported and challenged Obama's agenda. So in the Sebelius case in 2012, it struck down the provision that required states to expand Medicaid of the Affordable Care Act, but upheld the rest of the Affordable Care Act. The court made a key decision supporting liberal and democratic political views in the legalization of same-sex marriage in Obergefell versus Hodges, but in Shelby County versus Holder, the Supreme Court decision to invalidate key parts of the Voting Rights Act went against President Obama's policy efforts to strengthen federal oversight of state voting laws, particularly in areas with histories of discriminatory practices. Trump's administration, Trump was very fortunate with the ideological balance of the court, and he was able to shift it significantly to the right under his administration, and that's because he was effectively lucky in being able to appoint 3 Supreme Court justices. So these replaced 2 conservatives, but also 1 liberal justice, and that resulted in, once he'd left, a strong 6-3 conservative majority in the court by the end of his presidency. And this had implications for his policy goals and for broader legal and social issues. So the court, of course, didn't always make a ruling that went in his favour, as they were upholding the Constitution. They're not ultimately not a political body. The conservative majority did lead to favourable rulings. So in Trump versus Hawaii, it upheld Trump's travel ban. And in Department, so that shows in one case they did, but actually, on the other hand, in Department of Homeland Security versus Regents of the University of California, the court blocked Trump's efforts to end DACA. I think that shows how the constant limitation of the court, even if you have a majority that potentially aligns with your political. So if you have a conservative majority when you're a Republican, that doesn't mean you're going to be able to do whatever you want as well, because they are ultimately upholding the Constitution. But crucially, the most profound implications of Trump's appointments have come and will continue to come since he's left power. That was in particular in 2022 after he left power with the overturning of Roe v. Wade. That was a direct consequence of his appointment of conservative justices who he knew would likely make that ruling. In terms of Biden, the ideological composition of the court has remained a 6-3 conservative majority, despite him appointing one liberal justice, because effectively that was replacing Stephen Breyer, who went out as a liberal justice. And the conservative majority has led to key decisions that have halted Biden's agenda and pursued a conservative agenda and Republican priorities. So the first key one we already had a look through is ruling that his student debt forgiveness plan was unconstitutional. In Dobbs vs. Jackson Women's Health Organization, you saw the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and in Students First Fair admissions in 2023, you saw the kind of ruling that affirmative action in college admission process was unconstitutional. Okay, so what we're going to have a look at now, before we look at kind of the importance of timing and finally case studies of presidents, is other key factors that influence the president's power. First key one of these is their popularity. The popularity of a president plays a key role in determining their power and their effectiveness in office. They need the backing of their party to push through legislation, particularly in a polarised political environment, and they need to be popular in order to have that backing. High approval rating provide a president with increased political capital, enabling them to wield influence over Congress and shape legislative outcomes. So a popular president can exert influence over members of Congress within their own party, as the president's endorsement of their candidacy and being seen to support the president's agenda will be important in helping them get re-elected. Whereas an unpopular president doesn't have this political capital, can't exert this influence, and therefore is less likely to be able to convince members of Congress to support their legislative priorities. Successful policy initiatives and events, such as response to crises, can boost a president's popularity and strengthen their ability to advance their agenda, especially if they can create a rally around the flag effect as a kind of representative of the US and as the head of state. But unsuccessful policies and mishandling of important events can have the opposite effect and damage their popularity and ability to exert power. And under divided government, crucially also, popularity comes into it as well, as presidential power to pursue their agenda is in part dependent on how unpopular they are with the opposing party. So if it's a very polarised political environment and they're deeply unpopular with the opposing party, they're unlikely to be able to get anything done, and they're unlikely to be able to work in a bipartisan manner with the other party to get significant legislative achievements passed. Whereas if they're not they're never going to be popular with the other party, right? But if they're kind of, they have some agreement with key moderates and they're not deeply unpopular, and they can have more success in passing bipartisan legislation. The next key factor is the individual skills of a president. So the individual skills of a president in persuasion, relationship management, and event handling are paramount to their ability to wield power effectively. A president's capacity to persuade Congress and garner support for their agenda is pivotal in navigating the legislative process and enacting desired policies. And building and maintaining relationship with lawmakers both within their party and across the aisle can facilitate cooperation and consensus building, which is really key for advancing the kind of legislative agenda and priorities of the presidency. And also, if they can kind of effectively manage high-profile events and crises, this can influence public opinion, bolster their popularity, and therefore bolster the president's authority. For much more detail on the power of persuasion, how important that is, have a look at the previous video I've done on the informal powers of the presidency. And the final key thing we're going to look at before we look at timing is the relationship between a president and their party, which is really important to how powerful the president is and how effectively they can exert power of the legislative process. So strong support from party leaders and cohesion within the party bolster a president's ability to advance their agenda, as they rely on party unity to secure legislative victories, particularly in the recent context of hyperpartisan politics, where often bills are getting passed with no support from the other party. So you need to be able to get your kind of key congressional members of the party on your side to kind of whip and get everyone in line, so that pretty much all of your party supports the bill in order for it to get passed. The president standing with their party influences their ability to rally support for key initiatives and mobilise party members to act in unison. And effective collaboration with party leaders can foster this kind of cooperation and coordination to allow a kind of shared legislative agenda to be passed. In terms of Biden's administration, his ability to keep key members of his party in the Senate on side, in particular Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and moderates Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, who have often been kind of key swing votes on pieces of legislation, has been crucial to his ability to advance his policy agenda, given the very slim majority the Democrats have had in the Senate. So he successfully cooperated with House Speaker Pelosi and Senate Majority Leader Schumer to pass the American Rescue Plan Act. And after Manchin's lack of support led to the failure to pass the Build Back Better Act, he successfully negotiated with Manchin, Sinema, and Schumer to pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill, which a majority of Congress, including some moderate Republicans, could support. So that shows his real power to. Biden was quite successful in negotiating with moderates in the party to advance his legislative agenda despite a very slim majority, and I suppose his success in doing so and his positive relationship with key members of the Democratic Party was really important in doing so and bolstering his power. In terms of Trump, his relationship with Republican leaders in Congress, especially Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, was pivotal in defining his legislative successes and some of his legislative challenges. McConnell comes from the Republican establishment that was initially opposed to Trump's candidacy, but despite this, they were able to cooperate together to implement a number of highly important shared priorities, including the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 and the appointment of 3 conservative justices. The relationship was far from plain sailing, though, so there's friction over Trump's attempted repeal of the Affordable Care Act, which is ultimately unsuccessful due to opposition from moderate Republicans in Congress. And another point of friction was Trump's use of emergency powers to fund the construction of a border wall, a move that some Republicans in Congress, including McConnell, were hesitant to support due to concerns about executive overreach. Throughout his term, though, Trump's enduring popularity with the Republican base and the majority of Republican voters was critical in allowing him to have influence over Republican lawmakers who didn't want to publicly oppose his agenda, as it would result in them being very unlikely that they'd get re-elected. This was really evident in both of his impeachment trials, where the majority of Republican senators, influenced by Trump's hold of the party base, and knowing that if they voted to convict Trump of impeachment, they'd find it very difficult to get re-elected and would likely face a primary challenge, they voted against the conviction. And McConnell, despite acknowledging Trump's role in inciting the January 6th Capitol riot, ultimately voted for acquittal in the second impeachment trial. The next final key factors we're going to have a look at that influence the very nature of the president's power is timing. So the first 100 days is when the president's often the most powerful, and that's because they have the electoral mandate. And that comes from the fact that when they've been elected president, they've been given a clear and decisive endorsement by the electorate to implement their agenda. And this can bolster their power earlier in their term, as it instills a sense of urgency and legitimacy in pursuing their policy goals, and can really allow them to have a lot of influence over Congress. And they often leverage this honeymoon period to push through key pieces of legislation under what is almost always a unified government in the first 2 years of their presidency. So since FDR's famous first 100 days in office, when he put in place a range of programs to implement the New Deal, presidents are often judged on their first 100 days, and they're keen to have key achievements to show. So Biden passed the American Rescue Plan Act, Trump appointed Neil Gorsuch, and Obama passed the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act to address the Great Recession. Midterms are also really important in the timing across a presidency, and they occur halfway through a president's term, and they're crucial in shaping the remainder of their presidency, serving as a barometer of public opinion, and they can significantly alter the balance of power in Congress. So after a successful midterm for the president's party, they can sustain or even increase their ability to pass legislation, whereas a loss can lead to a gridlocked government and a president having to pursue their agenda unilaterally or try and cooperate with the opposing party in order to pass anything. And poor midterms can also indicate to a president's party and members of Congress that the president is unpopular, which can lead members of Congress to distance themselves from the president and their agenda. And crucially, as I kind of mentioned, if you lose one House of Congress during the midterms, which often happens, you go into divided government, and you often then have to move to a more bipartisan approach rather than trying to kind of pass your legislation just with support from your own party. And the final key thing we're going to have a look at in terms of timing is the lame duck presidency. And this refers to the period when a president is nearing the end of their tenure, particularly after a successor has been elected, and when they're ineligible for re-election. And during this phase, the president's power and influence typically diminishes. So policymakers, lobbyists, foreign leaders might begin to shift their focus to the incoming administration, reducing the incumbent's ability to shape policy or enact significant changes. During the last year of Obama's presidency, he was unable to successfully appoint Merrick Garland due to the Republican-controlled Senate arguing that because it was an election year, the next president should fulfill the vacancy. And this really broke with precedent, but I think really shows the decreasing power of the presidency in that final year. This being said, lame duck presidents can also see presidents taking bold actions, especially in foreign policy and through executive orders, and they're less constrained by political repercussions in these areas and have more unilateral control. So Bush negotiated a bailout for the auto industry during his lame duck period, and Obama took several foreign policy actions, including normalizing relations with Cuba, abstaining from a UN Security Council vote condemning Israeli settlements, breaking from long-standing US policy positions. Okay, so the final thing we're going to have a look at in this video is case studies in relation to recent presidents. We're going to have a look at Bush, Obama, Biden and Trump in relation to kind of key developments in their presidency over the time. Starting with Bush. So Bush had an early focus on domestic policy, but there was a shift to focus on the war on terror after 9/11. It was initially focused on domestic policies with significant legislative success in passing tax cuts and the No Child Left Behind Act, which brought in significant education reform. But the catastrophic events of 9/11 dramatically shifted his focus, with much of his presidency becoming defined by his response to 9/11 with the war on terror. He launched the war on terror, including the invasion of Afghanistan and the invasion of Iraq in 2003. And in the initial years of his presidency, Bush was extremely popular, with a rally round the flag effect, emboldening the war on terror and leading to the Republicans controlling the House and both houses of Congress after the 2002 midterms and after the 2004 presidential election when Bush won re-election. Domestically, he continued to pursue his conservative policies, including further tax cuts and attempts at Social Security reform. And his administration also enacted the Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act, significantly expanding Medicare provision. In terms of his second term, you saw growing opposition. So it was marked by continued involvement in Iraq and Afghanistan, and growing public discontent and challenges in managing the conflicts. So growing casualties and dragged out conflicts led to his declining popularity and growing opposition to the war on terror, especially as the US's international reputation was taking a big hit. Domestically, he also faced significant challenges, including the response to Hurricane Katrina, which was widely criticised, and the failure to pass immigration reform. And this contributed to Republicans losing control of both houses of Congress in 2006 midterms. And this led to the kind of final stage of his presidency, where kind of he had less influence, but it was defined by big events. And this was the financial crisis of 2008. Which led to significant government intervention in the economy kind of against traditional Republican priorities, but it was forced by events. And this included the Troubled Asset Relief Program, which aimed to stabilise the financial system by purchasing distressed assets from banks. And the response to the financial crisis and bailout of banks and the auto industry were key aspects of his late presidency. Moving on to Obama. So in the first 2 years, there were key legislative changes and a response to the financial crisis were really what defined his early years of his presidency. So it kind of commenced kind of immediately after the 2008, or kind of during effectively the financial crisis, and he was able to secure a number of key policy changes with a unified government. So he secured the passage of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009 to stimulate the economy and reformed financial regulation through the Dodd-Frank Act. And kind of, I suppose, this key reform introduced by his presidency, we eventually secured in 2010 with the Affordable Care Act. Then, after 2010, you saw the impact of midterms and a shift to executive actions. So the 2010 midterm elections were a key turning point for Obama's presidency, with Republicans gaining control of the House, which led to a divided government. And this shift resulted in legislative gridlock, most notably symbolised by the 2011 debt ceiling crisis. And in response, Obama increasingly relied on executive orders and regulatory actions in areas like immigration reform and environmental policy, as his ability to pass legislation through Congress was significantly diminished by a divided government. So he failed to pass the DREAM Act, and this led to him, for example, passing DACA through an executive order instead. And the Clean Power Plan, implemented through executive orders as well, aimed to reduce carbon emissions from power plants. And also kind of in this period was the assassination of Osama bin Laden, which was a key event in his presidency. In terms of his second term, you saw quite a significant focus on foreign policy with little legislative success. So despite winning election again, Obama had to deal with a divided government for the whole of his second term. This led to little legislative success on key policies, including gun control, immigration reform, and climate change. And he therefore continued to lose executive actions to seek his policy priorities, including an executive order in 2015 requiring federal contractors to provide employees with up to 7 days of paid sick leave per year. And legislative gridlock led to Obama focusing more on international issues, though some were more successful than others. So you saw kind of key executive agreements, including the negotiation of the Iran nuclear deal and the US signing it, as well as the US signing the Paris Climate Agreement. But he was limited in foreign policy in some areas by Congress in particular. So he failed to close Guantanamo Bay, and he had to back down on striking Syria after Assad used nuclear weapons in Syria. I think this was in 2013, due to opposition in Congress. And in his final year, he continued to be frustrated as a bit of a lame duck presidency, with, as we've touched on a number of times in this video, his failure to appoint Merrick Garland, which allowed Trump to make an appointment once he became president. Moving on to Trump now, so in the first 2 years, he had a strong electoral mandate and used this to instigate aggressive policy shifts. So his presidency began with a clear message of change, capitalising on the electoral mandate to reshape American foreign policy, or the American policy, not foreign policy, particularly in immigration, trade, and deregulation. So in 2017, he moved quickly to implement his agenda and use executive orders to undo many of the Obama-era policies. So you saw that kind of removing the US from the Paris Climate Agreement, and he also implemented a controversial travel ban aimed at several predominantly Muslim countries. He successfully kind of had some legislative achievements in this period, so successfully collaborating with the Republican establishment to pass the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and also appoint 2 conservative justices to the Supreme Court. But he was unable to fully repeal the Affordable Care Act or pass legislation to fund his border wall in Mexico due to a lack of support from some moderate Republicans in Congress. That was despite having unified government in this period. Then, similar to Obama, what you see is after the 2018 midterm elections is divided government, as the Democrats gained significant control of the House, introducing a significant check on Trump's power. And this led to heightened legislative gridlock, exemplified by the longest government shutdown ever. It was 35 days in relation to disputes over the border wall. And then you also had House impeachment proceedings in late 2019, which further exemplified the polarised political environment. In response, as with Obama, Trump increasingly relied on executive orders and veto power to pursue his agenda, such as declaring a national emergency to divert funds for the border wall. And he also devoted significant attention to foreign policy, in particular the Middle East, where his administration negotiated the Abraham Accords and assassinated General Qasem Soleimani. Despite losing control of Congress and significant controversy, Trump remained relatively popular and looked set to win the next election at this point, largely due to the success of the economy. What changed this was the pandemic in the final year of his presidency. This was really dominated by the COVID pandemic and his administration's chaotic and ineffective response, which led to the US having a very high death rate. And this ultimately contributed to his declining popularity and approval ratings, which was a really key factor in him losing the 2020 election. As prior to this period, as I mentioned, he was very popular in the polls. And ultimately, the 2020 election resulted in his defeat and his subsequent efforts to challenge the results and incite an insurrection in the January 6th riots. which is a really controversial end to a highly controversial presidency that led to his second impeachment after leaving office, though of course he was not convicted in either case. Final thing we'll have a look at is Biden so far. So the start of his presidency can be seen as kind of defined by the response to COVID and some led to success. So his presidency began amidst the COVID-19 pandemic with a primary focus on addressing COVID and its economic repercussions. And he had success, in particular with the passage of the American Rescue Plan Act. He was also able to pass a couple of kind of significant piece of legislation in his first 2 years, despite a very slim majority in the Senate that relied on his vice president, Kamala Harris, casting the deciding vote. So the Inflation Reduction Act, a key piece of legislation aimed at tackling climate change and challenging the economic influence of China, was passed with no support from Republicans. And the bipartisan infrastructure bill was passed with cooperation. So the bipartisan bill with cooperation from moderate Republicans. Biden also re-entered the Paris Climate Agreement and reversed various Trump-era policies, particularly in the areas of immigration, environmental regulation, and in foreign policy, he ended the US's military mission in Afghanistan, which garnered domestic support but international criticism for kind of how it was executed and its consequences with the Taliban coming back to power. So despite this kind of quite a few significant legislative achievements, his approval ratings were very low. And the Democrats lost control of the House in the midterms, though they didn't do as badly as expected and retain control of the Senate. And this was largely attributed due to the public's opposition to the Supreme Court overturning Roe v. Wade and kind of coming out in support of the Democrats and against the Republicans as a consequence of this. The second half of Biden's presidency so far has been less successful, with fewer legislative achievements and increasing criticism for a number of reasons listed below, leading his approval ratings remaining low and it looking like it's going to be a very close election this year. So despite relative success in kind of terms of GDP, inflation has led to high gas prices and high grocery prices, hitting the pockets of Americans, which kind of been really important in his unpopularity. He's been criticised by the left of the Democrats and large numbers of young people for his strong support for Israel, despite growing numbers of casualties and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Trump and much of the Republican Party has led criticism on the US's continued high foreign policy spending, particularly in Ukraine. The Biden administration's inability to halt the large number of illegal immigrants entering the US through the US-Mexico border has attracted criticism from Trump and many Republican states, with Texas Governor Greg Abbott responding by taking unprecedented unilateral action. And Biden's mental capabilities in his old age has been questioned due to a number of embarrassing mistakes and slip-ups at press conferences. So yeah, so it was a pretty long video. We've kind of gone through lots of different factors that affect the president's power. Some of them are constant, some are dependent on numbers, some really vary across the president's, across a kind of president's term. And we also had a look at some case studies there at the end. Let me know in the comment section below if you have any comments or questions, and I'll see you in the next video.